You're watching The Final Word. It's quite a boost for the Startup India campaign. Sources have told Bloomberg TV India that the Prime Minister's office of the PMO is keen on giving more incentives to entrepreneurs in the upcoming union budget.
And you know what, Fatima? The government is not alone in their efforts to provide a fillip to startups. Now, the RBI has also stepped in. Today, they've announced these steps to improve the ease of doing business and contribute to an ecosystem that's really conducive for the growth of startup businesses in the country. That's what we've got to know today.
So let's piece all of this together, because we've got our reporters who've been tracking the startup stories of the day. Ashutosh Kumar, of course, joining us from the capital, as well as Rukmini Rao, who's in Bangalore. Ashutosh, I'm going to come to you first. What have you really picked up from your sources in terms of the stimulus for startups in the budget that is being proposed at this stage?
Well, yes, that's one mega initiative coming up from the Prime Minister's office to give a leg up to the startups. According to our sources, the Prime Minister's office has asked the DIPP to work out some additional tax measures in addition to what has actually been announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on January 16 and come up with the proposals to the PMO. Now, according to our sources, what we are getting to hear is that the government is actually working on allowing the startups to have a choice in selection of the years in which in the selection of the 3 years in which they want to have a tax exemption than the first 3 years of operation that was earlier announced by the government. Also, the other aspects that are being looked into is abatement of service tax for the startups, and also relaxation of the compliance as far as the TDS and other compliances are concerned. Now, this indeed comes as a major initiative, and it all remains to be seen what Finance Minister Arun Jaitley actually incorporates when he announces the budget.
Right. So as far as the budget is concerned, this is a budget break that we are tracking right now. It's something that we'll be looking at very closely as far as the startup industry in the country is concerned. But Rukmini, to bring you in on this, after the government's repeated efforts to boost startups, we're seeing this push now from the central bank as well. If you can walk us through the kind of measures that are being proposed by the RBI to encourage this ecosystem, as it were, of entrepreneurship.
Well, after the Prime Minister, it's the RBI's turn to now lay out the red carpet for the Indian startup community. RBI proposing several changes in the regulatory structure to help perhaps doing business as far as startup goes. In fact, they will be looking at simplification of outward remittances, making online submission, and also simplification in terms of dealing with the process of delayed reporting in FDI, building in a penalty structure inside the regulation itself. Apart from that, also helping in terms of transfer of ownership as far as startup goes, and also enabling transfer of shares from foreign venture capitals, essentially to help stake sales and exits, and also investments. Apart from that, in fact, RBI is also under a consultation process with the central government to be able to perhaps help startups to access rupee loans under ECB framework, and also issuance of innovative FDI instruments like convertible notes by startup enterprises, and these kind of incentives. In fact, RBI will be shortly coming about with a circular notification under FEMA wherever is required. And also, in fact, RBI has interestingly created a dedicated mailbox, helpstart@rbi.org.in, to provide assistance and guidance to the startup sector. Back to you.
Okay, all right, Rukmini, thanks a lot for getting us all of that. That was Ashutosh and Rukmini really giving us the highlights in terms of what's coming out of the government, as well as what the RBI is proposing. I'd like to actually get some perspective from two people who are joining us as our guests on The Final Word right now. We've got Amarjeet Singh, he's a partner e-commerce and startups at KPMG. We also have Mr. Adhil Shetty, he's the CEO at bankbazaar.com. Mr. Shetty, I'm coming to you first. Given what you're hearing, which is, of course, the boost that the government has been talking about with the budget, as well as the measures that the RBI has been talking about, how do you think these could really help the startup culture in this country?
So I think the intent is very clear, right? I was at the startup event in Delhi where the Prime Minister was speaking, and there were so many senior government officials there, and they made it very clear that they want to support and they want to help startups grow. So the intent is very clear. I was very excited personally to see the RBI measures today. So as a company like Bank Bazaar, which has received multiple rounds of foreign venture capital investment, we know that whether it's being able to absorb that venture capital investment, being able to report it to the RBI, or even in terms of being able to transact on those shares, right? The process has been very paper driven, but with these new moves of automating and doing electronic form submission, quick approval, simplifying the process, I think it's all very exciting, and it just makes it so much easier for startups like us to do business. So I think we're also waiting for the notifications to actually come out, to study them, to understand them, and then to incorporate them. But I think the intent is great, and we'd like to see more of this.
So, we're waiting for the notifications. That system has to be put in place. But now with the RBI coming in and announcing several measures, that perhaps lays the roadmap, as it were. Amarjeet, why don't you come in on this? Because on the taxation front as well, the government is trying to do a lot. Like my colleague Ashutosh was just walking us through the kind of measures that the government would be proposing through the budget. Not least of which being being able to kind of choose the kind of tax holiday that the number of years, which those years are as well. The government wants to give startups the liberty to decide that as well. How much do you think it's actually coming together in terms of creating the right environment for startups to be able to do business?
If we just look at, whether it's the tax changes in the action plan or whether we look at the changes which have been brought in by RBI, all of them are completely aligned. What are they trying to do? They are trying to make funds available to a startup at a lower cost, with lower compliances, and with much more ease in terms of the instruments through which it can be done. For example, a change wherein an FVCI, which was earlier allowed to invest into only select sectors, is now allowed to invest in startups. Similarly, when FVCI has to actually transfer the shares held in a startup to a resident or a non-resident, there was some ambiguity in the language. The language, they say they will clarify very clearly these transfers can be made. Secondly, I think a very big change, when an investor is putting in money, they put in money in the form of they would like to put in money slowly and gradually into a startup to look at the performance. Similarly, from a startup perspective, they would not like to dilute very quickly. So they would like the consideration to come over a period of time. So therefore, they are talking about escrow arrangement now being allowed from 6 months to 18 months. Similarly, trying to reduce compliances by making Form A2 online, or if there's a delay in reporting, then there would be some clearly compounding things. And similarly, if we just look at from a tax perspective, what they did, they said that if there are capital gains being earned and if you put the money into a fund of funds, then you don't have to pay taxes. Or they're saying that if anybody is putting money into a startup at a premium, that premium will not become income. So it's all aligned. All these changes which are being done, they are based upon the genuine problems which were being faced by startups. So the government is listening. The government is bringing in changes which I think will make this ecosystem go much more lively. And the point is, if the government is working on some incremental item on taxes, I think it's going to become something. India is definitely going to become a thriving place for doing startups.
Okay, and Mr. Singh, it's wonderful to hear that from you, because you've of course been looking at this whole ecosystem for a very long time. Mr. Shetty, I want to come to you on this. You just heard Mr. Amarjeet Singh really talking about the kind of incentives, the creativity, the tax flow, the kind of timelines, all of these things. And he's also saying that if we do this right, we could really be a flourishing startup economy. Have they taken the kind of measures that you could really see for the next big jump?
So I think in the last few years, right, we've had a lot of good investors in India. We've had a lot of companies coming up. So there's a lot of action happening on the ground as we speak. I think what the government and the RBI are now looking at is saying, what more can we do, since we know that there's a groundswell coming up? What more can we do to make it easy? So I think the first set of announcements which we heard in Startup India from the action plan were all positive, and now we're waiting for the budget, because we know that you can save on capital gains by putting it in the fund of funds of the government, but we're looking towards the budget to see can it be treated similar to capital gains on a public market exchange traded share, wherein after 3 years there's no long-term capital gains. So I think the initial steps have been taken. I think today's RBI announcement was great, right? Because when you get FVCI money, the reporting you go through, the forms you fill in, which sectors FVCIs can invest in, how do they transfer shares, how, if you have operations in Singapore, how do you move money into Singapore? All of these issues, right, are fairly complex issues, and there's a lot of compliance around it. And I think it's genuinely a great step that the RBI is thinking about, how do I make this simpler for a startup in order to do it, because essentially every startup needs to do it at some point in time. And I think that as we see these notifications come out, as we see the budget come out, we'll actually see the rubber hit the road, and our lives start to become much easier as we accelerate on our growth path, right? So I think the intent is great, and I think the trajectory is strong. Looking forward to seeing all this implementation go out.
It's always a question about implementation at the end of the day, right, Amarjeet? You'd agree with what Adhil is saying over here as well. But also when you talk about sweat equity, you're talking about ESOPs as well. Do you think that path is getting cleared for the kind of payments that go out, the non-cash payments that go out as far as startups are concerned?
Yeah.
See the point, I think if we just look at what was the issue, there are already existing guidelines in relation to stock options, sweat equity, etc. But there was a lot more clarity required. Can a promoter be issued sweat equity, etc.? And that's what we think. I think greater clarification is going to come. At the same time, MCA also made some changes in relation to sweat equity. So as I said, that Ministry of Corporate Affairs, RBI, income tax, all of them are trying to come together as part of the single action plan. Also, the government is also consulting in terms of rupee-denominated ECB, whether it can be accessed by a startup and they are going to define who could be an eligible lender. I think that would be a great thing. The money would be available not only as investment, it will also be available in the form of debt. Then talking about convertible notes, I think that's a fantastic thing. Globally, all the startups across the world are working on convertible loan kind of concept. I think if India allows that, up till now it was only ECBs, or it was only compulsory convertible debentures which were allowed. A convertible loan will be a change, I think, which will see the funding requirements of startups being addressed very quickly. At the same time, on the outbound side, I think some of the issues which were faced by a startup when they were acquiring a foreign company was sometimes the foreign company having subsidiaries in India, whether this was an issue where you need to take an approval from Reserve Bank of India. I think that might be clarified. Also, having a collection, the ability to collect money from non-residents within India through a bank account, I think those are kind of changes which are very progressive changes, which will make some of these business models which the startups want to get into much more easier to operate, and will make them more commercially viable.
Okay, I just want to thank Mr. Amarjeet Singh as well as Mr. Adhil Shetty for really giving us their views, and of course our reporters for really bringing us those stories. Thanks a lot for coming on to The Final Word.
And we'll take a very quick break on that note, but coming up is all the action on Wall Street. Do stay with us.
While it's purpose-built, it's not extreme in its nature. It's got a very tolerant band in which you can operate it in.
And brace yourself for the Royal Enfield Himalayan unleashed by the Eicher stable. Just today, we are speaking to the MD and CEO of the company, Siddharth Lal.